Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlook here. So in class we read a short piece about federalism. We talked in class about some of the pros, the cons, kind of made sure we were all on the same page of this idea of federalism, why it matters for our study of Colorado politics. Because in the class we're going to look at how public policy works in the state of Colorado, but we're also going to look at how that system works in the overarching political science literature. What does political science tell us and help us understand about Colorado politics? So federalism is a good place to start because it helps us understand how the state is governed and then how the state's governed differently than other states. So I did want to make a follow-up video. In my first video, we kind of looked at just what is federalism from the 30,000 foot level, some pros and some cons of federalism. Today, I want to take that introduction a little bit further, still kind of at the high level, but I want to see what it looks like in practice. So we tried to start introducing this in class when we were talking about marijuana policy, but I wanted to dig deeper into it and use some other examples from this lecture is mainly from the OpenStax U.S. government textbook, which I didn't require students to read. I didn't think it was necessary for our purpose. Some of my students have read it in the past, so this is a very similar discussion. But maybe this is your first introduction to federalism, to political science. And so maybe if you don't quite understand yet what federalism is, this is probably worth watching for you. So again, in our previous video, we talked about how federalism is this division of governing authority between a national government and the states, or the national government and the local level. So that definition can feel a bit abstract though, if we don't think about, well, what does that actually look like in practice? So for this video, I wanted to think about how does public policy, how do things sometimes look different in Colorado versus other states? And so when we think about how that can be, it's this idea that we've been talking about of federalism. So when we think of public policy in Colorado, it can sometimes look different than even a neighbor state like Wyoming. So the textbook example, the one we used in class, and I think every textbook uses this example, is marijuana policy. It's probably one of the easiest examples to start with because we hear about it talked about in our own lives. We see it from one state to the next. So here in Colorado in 2012, Colorado voters approved Amendment 64, which legalized recreational marijuana for adults. So at that time in 2012, Colorado was one of the first states in the country to take that step, especially for recreational purposes. So this gives us a pretty clear example of something that we talked about in class that all the textbooks use. The idea, though, that states are laboratories of democracy. So a state can try something new. Rather than the entire country changing marijuana policy in 2012, individual states were able to experiment with different approaches. Colorado adopted one approach. Other states continue today to take other approaches. Maybe it's decriminalization for medical purposes or completely banned. So we see this idea of laboratories of democracy allowing different states to have different policies. We could look at this through all kinds of things that we did in class. Tax revenue. What else did we use in class? Tax, public health, criminal justice. All kinds of things look different. But marijuana policy is so front and center. So when we think of marijuana policy, 2012, Colorado decriminalizes, and then over time, other states have began either adopting similar policies because maybe they liked the outcome, maybe they liked the tax revenue, maybe there was a demand from their citizens, so they followed suit. These ideas of laboratories of democracies. So here, when we talked about an advantage of federalism, this is a clear advantage. States can experiment. New policy does not necessarily have to win support across the entirety of the United States before people try it. One state can try a minimum wage increase, marijuana policy, and then if that is successful, other states can try it as well. Again, they don't all have to, though. Maybe they decide that's not something we want in this state. Laboratories of democracy. So, this also does show that federalism can be complicated. So when we talked about some of the drawbacks of federalism, one thing that we talked about was the complications. So 2012, Colorado changed its law. But federal marijuana law did not automatically change. At the federal level, federal marijuana law did not change overnight, and it's still prohibited under federal law. Marijuana is still prohibited under federal law. And now, at the outset, that might actually sound kind of strange, but it is kind of a useful insight into the complexities and difficulties of federalism. At the national level, we see that it is not legalized. We talked about in class, it also creates this confusion from one state to the next. Well, what happens if something is legal in one state but not the other? So the issue of marijuana policy, interestingly, does show both sides of federalism, that it allows laboratories of democracy, that positive aspect of it, but it also shows some of the complexity of federalism. I also wanted to talk about elections. So elections are another interesting example of federalism that we see in the news a lot today. So oftentimes when people talk about elections, they might think of one single national election systems. But that's not really how American elections work. States themselves have substantial authority over how elections are administered, the rules of the road of those elections. Here we can see in Colorado, Colorado relies heavily on mail voting, mail-in ballots. Eligible voters generally receive ballots through the mail, and Colorado has developed an election system in which mail ballots are really central to us as voters because they show up in our mailbox, we fill them out, we drop them off, we send them back in. If you grew up in Colorado and you voted in Colorado, this is just a part of your life. Other states, though, organize elections differently. Some rely much more heavily on traditional election day voting, that you have to show up at the poll, that you have to show ID, and then you vote in a polling booth. So states also have different roles governing voter registration. How far in advance of the election do you have to register to vote to be able to vote? States vary on how much they allow early voting. Can you vote a couple weeks early, or is it a couple days early, or do you have to vote on the day of the election? Identification requirements, a huge difference from state to state. Some states require you to show a government-issued ID at the voting booth. Other states are more flexible on maybe you don't even have to show an ID. So we see things like ballot access, electoral administration. States handle these things very differently. And when we think of like why or how can they, well, that is rooted in this idea of federalism, that states have the ability, the capacity, and the responsibility to run the elections within their state. So we see here again laboratories of democracy. Well, why does one state do it in one way and another state does it another way? It allows flexibility. It allows voters and policymakers to try to figure out what works best for our constituency and our state. So when we think of federalism, it's maybe complicated at first, but when we start to think about, okay, well, where do we see this in practice? Well, we can see it from the national to the states, but we can also see it from state to state. And we just intuitively know this. We hear about, California is trying to pass a minimum wage increase, but we know in some other states it's lower. So we just take as part of our democratic system that some states have different policies than others, while the federal government still has some overriding policies. But then we get into this complexity. What happens if states kind of ignore? And so federalism is a hallmark of American democracy, but it is complicated, and it is an interesting phenomenon to research. Thank you.